All right, let's talk about bones of the articulatory system and skull. But before we get to bones, let's just talk about resonance. So, resonation, this is what we're talking about this week, or this area is resonation. And essentially, what's going on is so to connect this to what we just talked about, we have vocal folds, which are giving us the buzz, the laryngeal buzz. That buzz is not just one single pitch, it's a pitch and harmonics on top of the pitch. So there's one frequency and then frequencies on top that are related to that frequency. So what comes out sounds like kind of a sawtooth wave, like a kind of sound. And that needs to get molded into an E or an oo or a k, something like that. So, actually, a k is not a. It's not doesn't have any vocalization. So, like a z, z has vocalization too. We're doing all the others, but since I started talking about vocal folds, like a k doesn't use vocal folds because it's not doesn't have phonation. So anyway, we'll go into this. It just was a bad example for that moment. So, what is going on with sound? How does this work? Well, how this works is resonance. Resonance in a tube. There's a class that I teach and that other people teach. It was actually just me and one other person that you might take it with online. I think that's true. About acoustics called speech science. And we get way more into this in that class. But for now, essentially what happens is you can think of the mouth as a tube. And of course, there's kind of two tubes. If your velum is up and this is closed off, there's just one tube. Comes up here, comes out here. It has a curve in it, but that's okay. It's basically a tube. And so we can just kind of use the physics of a tube to figure out what's going on with the way that the sound resonates inside of that tube. If your velum's down, all of a sudden you have two tubes, and that's cool too. We can just use the physics of two tubes to figure out the resonance inside of that. Okay, cool. Well, so not very difficult. I mean, there's some math involved, and again, when you're in that class, you'll have to do the math, but in this class, you don't have to do the math. You just have to kind of understand the basic idea of what's going on. And the basic idea of what's going on is different constrictions inside this tube, because you don't really have constrictions inside this top tube in the nasal cavity because there's no muscles and articulators inside the nose, so you can't like wrinkle it down and create a like a constriction there. But you can here. You can move the tongue in different places. So if you say E, feel where your tongue is. The E, E is kind of in the front, more towards the front of your mouth. The tongue gets kind of high. And then E, you can feel the constriction move backwards. And then ah, there's not really any constriction at all. Big open sound. The constriction, where your tongue is going to change the sound entirely. E, ah, ooh. There's a constriction at your lips for ooh. So where these constrictions are changes the resonant properties of the sound coming from the vocal folds. And the changes in those resonant properties are speech sounds. Those are phonemes. Like, so now we've got how the actual phonation happens here. We just learned about that. And now what we're learning about is what muscles and bones and other structures are creating the constrictions that actually lead to the different speech sounds. So you can assume that in the prior unit, when we're talking about phonation, if there's issues there, it would impact the creation of the laryngeal buzz. Now, if we have issues in the resonance and articulation area, like up from the larynx, that's going to impact your ability to create resonation or to articulate phonemes correctly. And we'll talk about those once we get to like clinical concerns. Okay, so what is resonance? Well, essentially what resonance is there are some cavities of some size are going to resonate some frequencies better than others. They're going to dampen some frequencies. Some frequencies they're not really going to have an effect on. And the way that this happens is each frequency, if you are taking 311 now, if you have taken 311, you know that every frequency has a corresponding wavelength. And so what's going on is if the wavelength of a frequency is equal to or approximately equal to a cavity, like a tube or part of a tube. So like if you say, when we're looking for, again, I know there's not there's not vocalization for that, but we still can look at resonance. So when you say a k, you have a tube behind the constriction and a tube in front, and those are both going to contribute to the resonant properties of the k, like how it actually sounds, and why a k is different than a g, which is also different than a t. If you close your eyes and just listen, you can tell if I'm saying t or k, and it's all based on the resonance peaks. So the tube, the whole tube, the speech tube all the way out, where the constrictions are, or if you constrict the tube enough that there's essentially two tubes, the length of those tubes is going to associate with the wavelength of different frequencies and resonate the frequencies that have the same wavelength, or integer multiples of that wavelength, and it'll dampen waves that are further away from those wavelengths. Let's take a look at how this works. They never want me to show these videos. Okay. This is a video on Chladni plates, which is how this is pronounced. I like the sound of that word, Chladni plates. I also like the sound of what's happening here. I'm going to put a link to this online because the sound is actually kind of grating. So you can choose if you want to listen to this or not. So I'll just narrate over this instead of you hearing the... It's actually a terrible noise. It's this violin bow on metal. So you can kind of envision what this sounds like. Just a screech. Okay. So what's important here, what's important to note here is the shape. So what's going on is this guy, who I think I saw, they said that his name was Daniel, is taking this violin bow and running it along the side of this plate. It's kind of a lowish frequency, like about that frequency, kind of low for a violin bow on a metal plate. And it makes a certain shape. The shape that it makes is because of the shape that the plate is. The way that the plate can deform because of the sound waves traveling through it is different depending on the shape. The circles, the larger circle, the smaller circle, are going to look similar because they're circles, while the square, I don't know why I couldn't think of the word for square. Well, the square is always going to look different, like square-ish. But what's really interesting about this is what we're going to see is he's going to move the violin bow in a way that makes a higher frequency pitch. And it's actually going to double the frequency that he's using right now. And what's going to happen is you're going to see more of those lines appear. So I'm going to say more about those, but I'm going to wait for the lines to appear. Also, this oval is going to have some different shaped lines than all the rest of these. We're not going to watch them all. You can watch them yourself and like amaze your friends. because this is cool. Okay, so we're going into the higher frequency here, and all of a sudden, a new line appears in the middle of all those other lines. More sand. There we go. Twice as many lines as there were before. So what's happening is, let me go back to, oh, this is pretty good. Okay, so this is the square. We'll just kind of fast forward so I can give you a nice top-down view of this. There we go. So what's happening is you've got some parts of the plate called nodes and antinodes. A node always stays in place. If you think of a wave, so from either 205 or 311, you've learned about a wave. Think of a sine wave. Think of any wave, I guess, really. And there's nodes and antinodes. The nodes are always going to stay in place. They're going to stay in the same spot. An antinode is the opposite, and it's where the wave can be at its highest and then simultaneously the lowest, right? Because a wave is going to come up and then down, up, down, up, down. The node is always in the same place. So what happens is the sand starts collecting at the node. And that doesn't maybe make a ton of sense because sometimes the antinode is lower. So why would the sand move somewhere higher if the antinode is sometimes lower? Well, because it's also sometimes higher. And so this jumping around motion just kind of like flings the sand off of it and into the node space. So Chladni plates are essentially showing us where the nodes are while these plates are vibrating. So the vibration runs through the plates. The sand is showing us where the nodes are. And essentially what this is also showing us, the number of nodes is showing us the resonant frequency of this plate. There's a couple resonant frequencies because you can play the low frequency, the mid frequency, and the high frequency on all the plates. And what happens is it doubles each time. So if there were 8 lines on that first circular plate, there becomes 16 lines when you go to the next highest frequency, and then there's 32 lines when you go to the really high frequency. Theoretically, you could go beyond that, but I am not sure that you can get a violin bow to resonate at any higher frequencies than that third one. So you could go like forever, potentially. Anyway, that's resonance. If that doesn't fully explain resonance, that's okay, because we have some other ways to talk about this. I think this is where I want to go next. That's the same thing. What I wanted to show you was the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse. Okay. So essentially what's going on here, it's a real bridge. I can let this play while I talk about this. This is a real bridge in 1940. And essentially what's going on is wind is blowing through the sound, basically, the Tacoma Narrows, which is like you follow the sound of Seattle down further. There's a lot of wind that travels through. The wind happens to be blowing at a speed to create a vibration that is the resonant frequency of the bridge. So once the bridge starts vibrating at that frequency, it continues to build on itself because the frequency doesn't stop. The wind's blowing at the same speed. And so the resonance builds and builds and builds and builds until you get this kind of motion. And then there it goes. This isn't the only time that's happened. There's also the Millennium Bridge in London. A similar thing happened here, except it wasn't. I'm going to tell you, trying to talk over this while they're talking is really difficult to like keep a train of thought while someone else. Anyway, it makes it more like an in-person class, I guess. So this is Millennium Bridge, built in like around 2000. And it wasn't wind this time. What was actually going on is people walking, the footsteps of people walking, set the bridge into kind of an oscillatory motion. And that made the rest of the crowd walk in a more oscillatory motion, which then built on itself, like it fed back into like the people, the gait of the people walking fed into the bridge vibrations fed back into the gait of the people walking, and eventually the entire bridge was swaying like in the beginning of the clip here. If it ever shows it. Yeah, there we go. Like just this crazy side-to-side motion. This was on like the opening day of the bridge. They had to shut it down because they were worried that it was going to tear itself apart just like the other bridge. So this is resonance. It doesn't just happen with sound. It happens with anything that can have a frequency. Okay. Let's keep going. The pharynx is the first resonant cavity that we come to after the larynx. And we can break the pharynx into 3 different parts. Also, I have a note here that, some people say the pharynx actually isn't the first resonating body, that the larynx has resonance properties of its own, and that is probably true. We don't know how much of a part they play into speech, if at all. But the pharynx is usually considered the first point of resonance. And like I said, we can break the pharynx into 3 different parts. The nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, or if you're coming from the vocal folds, if you're like tracing the direction that the sound is moving up, then you've got laryngopharynx, which is right above the larynx, oropharynx, which is right behind the mouth, and nasopharynx, which is right behind the nasal opening. Okay, so now, bones, like I talked about at the beginning. So in the skull, there's 22 different bones that we're going to break into 2 different groups. We're going to break them into cranial bones and facial bones. 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. Aside from the mandible, all the skull bones are joined by sinoarthroidal joints. We'll talk about what those mean in a second, but essentially it just means that the skull is essentially all one conjoined bone. They don't start out as one bone. They're multiple bones that are joined together, but they don't articulate against one another. They're fused. And there's the mandible. Aside from the mandible, all the skull bones are joined by sinoarthroidal joints, which again just means they're fused together. Let's talk about these cranial bones. Some of them are paired, some of them are unpaired. Paired just means that there's a left and right version, and unpaired means there's just one, so there's not a left and right version. A lot of these are going to be really easy for you to remember, because if you remember all the way back to the neuro module, it's the same as the lobes of the brain. So let's start with those. We've got the parietal bone. That's paired. There's a left and right parietal bone. Temporal bone, that's paired. There's a left and right temporal bone. And of course, parietal bone roughly covers the parietal lobe. Temporal bone roughly covers the temporal lobe. We've got a frontal bone. There's just one of those. That's unpaired. Just one frontal bone. That, of course, covers the frontal lobe. I think you see where this is going. Occipital bone, there's just one of those right in the center. That covers the occipital lobe. Easy. Also, we can do another callback here. Remember the atlanto-occipital dislocation that we talked about. So the atlanto is the atlas. It's the C1, the first spinal bone, where we articulate the spine against the skull. And the atlanto-occipital part, the occipital there, is this occipital bone. So now we're like linking everything back together finally. And then there's two that are pictured on here that aren't something that we kind of already have a link to. That's the sphenoid and the ethmoid. But first, let's talk about the sphenoid bone. That's this pink one here that sort of looks like the country Togo, I think. That's like a deep cut if you like memorize countries. I don't memorize countries just for fun. When I was in high school, there was a teacher that said if you memorize all the countries in the world, you'd get extra credit. And I did. And then I asked him about it, and he's like, that was a joke. And I was like, oh, but I did memorize all the countries. Can I have the extra credit? He didn't give me any extra credit. But now I know all the countries in the world. So, this is the sphenoid bone. It is not paired. It looks like it would be. Like you would think that there's a left and right half to this, but that's not true. And the reason for that is it goes through the entire skull from one side to the other. This is like a frontal view of the sphenoid bone. It's been taken out, of course, of the skull. And this is what it looks like. Kind of like a bat. Some people say a butterfly. It looks a little too creepy to be a butterfly. Moth works. I still think it looks like a bat. But whatever. They're all fine answers. No answer is better than the other. So this is an unpaired bone. Just one of these runs across the entire inside of the skull. And so like roughly, like if you follow your eye socket, and then this arch right here back a little bit, this is where the sphenoid bone is. Right there. And then it goes all the way behind your eyes. And forms part of the orbital socket, in addition to some attachment points for muscles that we'll talk about later. Oh, man, sorry about that. Just slapped my microphone and destroyed your ears, probably. Okay, sphenoid bone is unpaired. And then let's talk about the ethmoid. Ethmoid is the red one that you can see just like right inside the orbital socket there. This is, again, a frontal view of the ethmoid bone. And it's unpaired as well. It, again, would look like from the outside that there's two of them, one on each eye socket. But no, it actually runs, again, through the middle of the skull. This one kind of looks like a sparrow or like a freaky angel, like a Chris angel, like a mind freak kind of thing. All sorts of awesome sinuses inside. These are good for like creating resonant frequencies and also helping air warm up before that gets into your lungs if you're breathing through your nose. There's a couple important parts of the ethmoid bone that we want to talk about. So first of all, this outside part, that forms part of the orbital socket. That's somewhat important. But even more important than that is, I guess I'm just going to show you with my cursor here, is this right here. So we've got there we go. So right here, this is the crista galli. This protrudes into the cranial cavity, and this is actually one of the attachment points for the dura mater. So the crista galli will like poke into the frontal bone, like a thumb poking through these fingers here, and then the dura mater attaches to the crista galli to hold everything in place. Remember the meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. Well, the dura mater attaches to the one of several places it attaches to crista galli. And then the other important thing that we want to talk about is this perpendicular plate. This forms part of the septum, along with the vomer. We'll talk about the vomer on today in this video, but not right now. I don't have a picture of it right now. Actually, I do have a picture of it right now. So here's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. It's the top half of the vomer. And if you look at this guy right here, so highlighted in green, that's, of course, the ethmoid bone that we're looking at. Here's the perpendicular plate. And this below it that is part of the septum but isn't highlighted in green, that's the vomer. And we'll take another look at it later. But the vomer and the perpendicular plate form the septum, the nasal septum. If you have a deviated septum, what's going on is the vomer and the perpendicular plate in your nose are not aligned correctly. They might be next to each other like this. They might be kind of like off at an angle like that, but in some form, they're not just sitting right on top of each other. That's what a deviated septum is. Okay, let's keep going. Back to our sphenoid bone. Let's talk about cranial sutures. This is fun stuff too. So the cranial sutures are the lines where the cranial bones have fused, and in young children, these are not fused yet. So if you know about the soft spot or soft spots, there's actually a couple different soft spots. Those are places where not only are the bones not fused, but the bones are pretty far apart. So there's just like an area of skin and tissue, and then right under that is dura mater, essentially. So the skull is somewhat not protected in those areas. That's why you're supposed to be extremely careful with the soft spots. And those soft spots are called fontanelles. So you can see right here, this is the anterior fontanelle. That's the soft spot on the top of the head. So that's like the main soft spot that people talk about. It's the largest one, anterior fontanelle. There's also this over here, the mastoid fontanelle. So it's another soft spot a little bit behind the ear. That's another one to be worried about. One of the things with babies is you can see their heartbeat at the soft spot, and the reason for this is because the arachnoid mater is right below that. There's a lot of veins running through the arachnoid mater. There's also a lot of veins running to the epithelial tissue just on the surface of the head. And so you get both of those together, and you can see just the movement of the skin because of the pressure changes with the heartbeat. As the skull closes up, you can't see it. Like, you can't just find a bald guy and be like, oh, I can see your heartbeat. It only works in babies because of the fontanelle. Okay, so let's talk about these sutures. We already talked about the fontanelles. Down here, closes between 12 and 18 months. So let's talk about the other stuff. So the coronal suture is right here. The coronal suture fuses the frontal and parietal bones. So frontal bone here, just one frontal bone, and then the two parietal bones left and right. That's going to fuse along the coronal suture. Coronal suture, again, should tie back to something that you already know. The coronal slice, which comes down like this. So the coronal suture, very similar to the coronal slice in terms of the plane that it's on. The coronal suture is on a coronal plane. We've also got where the frontal bone, so this is the frontal, remember, is unpaired, but it's kind of like it has two wings that eventually like fuse together. So it's totally one bone in the front, like on the baby's forehead, but then you've got these wings right here, and those are going to have to fuse, and the parietal bones are going to have to fuse together also. And those fuse together along the sagittal suture, which again, sagittal plane, sagittal suture. Such easy stuff. Like, it's all coming back together, right? Like, you learned it before, and now you don't really have to learn it again because it already is a thing. Anyway. Okay, here's a weird one, though. So what I just said, well, may not be entirely true, because we've got something called a lambdoidal suture. which is right here. The lambdoidal suture is going to fuse the parietal bone and the occipital bone. Lambdoidal, crazy word. Which, by the way, I realize this picture that I have here says lamboidal. That's wrong. Like, I know it seems like mine is wrong. Lambdoidal is not. It is the craziest word. But it is lambdoidal. So, why is it called this? Because it's kind of shaped like the Greek letter lambda. If you look at it in the back, it's just kind of a burp, burp. Like a top two parts of a triangle, basically, which is similar to a lambda. And so that's why it's called the lambdoidal suture. But again, that's where the parietal bones and the occipital bone will fuse together. Next, another one that we haven't talked about, like a plane that we haven't talked about because it's not really a plane, is the squamosal suture. So that's right here where the parietal bone and the temporal bone are going to fuse together. You've got the squamosal suture. And on either side of those, you've got a little fontanelle. Mastoid fontanelle we talked about. There's a little sphenoid fontanelle here. It's not very large, but it would be like right in that like Professor X spot where you touch to make it look like you're doing, mind. The word is gone. Why does this happen? It doesn't matter. It's not even a part of the class that I need to say. So we're just gonna ignore it. It'll come back at some point. Telekinetic. There we go. Make it look like you're doing telekinetic stuff by touching roughly where the sphenoidal fontanelle is. But the important part here is squamosal suture is temporal and parietal bones fused together along there. And those are the sutures. We talked about the fontanelles. Those are the sutures. Okay, one other thing that I want to hit on really quickly, and then we're going to stop here and pick up with facial bones in the next video, are premature closure and Wormian bones. So these are some kind of like, one is a clinical condition, the other is just a thing that happens. It's kind of interesting. Premature closure, also called craniosynostosis, is premature closure of the sinoarthroidal joints. This isn't good. That one of the reasons why the cranial bones aren't sutured together at birth is so the head can fit through the birth canal, to be nice to our mothers, right? So that's great. And the other reason is so that the brain can continue to grow after birth. So if you have craniosynostosis, that means that the bones are closing too early. The brain is not going to stop growing. And in fact, what happens is, if this goes unchecked, you can end up with brain damage. That doesn't happen very often anymore, at least in most countries. And the reason for that is, like we know about it, we can test for this. And what you do is you go in and you just kind of like surgically open the bones again to allow for the brain to grow and then allow the bones to close naturally later. And so you don't have a ton of children with birth defects related to craniosynostosis anymore because of that. Like, we know how to look for it. We know how to accommodate it. In extremely poor rural areas, this, of course, can still happen. But just a reason to bring medical care to all parts of the world, right? It's easy to do. We should be doing that. Everybody that lives in a major population center should have like a sense of responsibility to bring healthcare to the rest of the world. Let's go on to Wormian bones. This is just fun, crazy stuff. These are the Wormian bones right here. These are extra bones that just appear like in the suture zone. So like right along the suture lines, there's extra bones. They're just like little islands of bone that show up. They were originally called Incan bones because the people who first noticed them noticed that they occur within specifically like northern part of South America in the native populations exclusively. At first, they thought it was. They noticed them on these like elongated skulls, which were done for like religious and cultural purposes among that same group, like around the Incan areas, around Peru, places like that. So the native populations around there did this cranial elongation, and so archaeologists assume this was like something that happened because of cranium stretching. That's actually not true, because the one on top, this picture on top, is not a stretched skull. This is just a regular skull found in the same region, and it's just a genetic thing. It doesn't do anything for, or there's no pluses and minuses to wormian bones. They just are an interesting thing that happens to a genetic linked trait. It's pretty interesting. Just evolution being weird. Okay. And that's what we have. We're going to look at facial bones in the next video. But this video is getting kind of long, so we're going to put in a little stop place here, and we'll come back and talk about the rest in, I guess, however long you want it to be.